Life Audio.
Hello, and welcome to the Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic podcast. I am your host, John Seidel. This is your home for real stories, radical vulnerability, and remarkable comebacks. In the end, this podcast is a place for the desperate, the downtrodden, the destitute, and especially the drunk. But it's also a place of hope and healing. I know that firsthand because I'm the Christian who became an alcoholic, not the other way around. Today, I've found sobriety after decades of struggling. But more importantly than finding sobriety, I found Jesus. My prayer is that as I interview people just like you and just like me, along with professionals in the fields of trauma, faith, and addiction recovery, you will find the peace that is available to you through Christ on the other side of whatever you're going through and whatever addiction that might be. Because let's face it, we're all addicted to something. So welcome. Let's get radically vulnerable as we explore what it looks like to be on this journey of messy sanctification. We'll be right back after this. Do you remember when you grew up believing something to be true or being told something for so long, and that moment that you realized, oh my word, that's not true, or that's different than what I've been taught? I had a couple of those moments with our guest today, Gina Birkemeier. And Gina is someone who I have come to know and respect. She has been a cheerleader for me without really even knowing me initially. We've gotten to know each other. And Gina is a licensed therapist. She's an author. And she is someone who is also in addiction recovery herself. She had a childhood that was it was hard. And there are plenty of things that I can relate to in her story. And so she wrote a book called Generations Deep. And this book did a lot for me, especially in the early parts of my addiction recovery. And one of them is, first of all, I felt seen. And I know that term, you can be like, I felt so seen. And maybe that comes across as a little trite, and I'm sorry, but I really did feel seen. I felt like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone. But it also introduced me more in depth to this idea called epigenetics. And we're going to talk about epigenetics today. And basically it's how trauma is passed down through our genes. And that you may be like, what? How can something externally done to you then pass down in DNA, right? And I think that's what I thought at first. But this is a Harvard verified thing. I talk about this in my book and cite some Harvard research on epigenetics, but it basically shows how trauma affects how our genes are expressed and basically how we pass down trauma to other generations if we don't heal it. And so, if you've been following along for any amount of time, you know that I am big on, we've got to get to the root of the problem. And I was even just talking to someone today. I asked them that question and they said, I don't know the root of my problem. And instead of saying, I don't think there is one, my encouragement is you just got to keep digging. And what I'm saying there is not, well, everyone, has some sort of, sexual trauma in the past that's just, a repressed memory. That's not what I'm saying. But I think trauma, we have come to say trauma is only these what are called big T things. They're the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, those things that we think of as trauma. But actually trauma is much bigger than that. Adam Young, who's a counselor or a social worker who's written a great book. He's going to be coming on the podcast and talking about that a little bit. So is Dan Allender. He's talked about that a lot. But that our traumas are not just those big T things, the little T things as well. There's attunement trauma, for example, where you didn't get the attention that you need. Kurt Thompson, the Christian psychiatrist, says that we come into this world looking for someone looking for us as babies. And he talks about the science behind that. And so a lot of you maybe didn't have someone looking at you You didn't have someone looking for you, looking out for you. And that's a form of trauma. And I'm not just trying to be all willy-nilly with that word. And so Gina helped me understand how we can pass that on if we don't heal it. She also really helped me understand the verses in the Bible about generational curses. Oh my gosh, this is such a good discussion. And finally, she blew my mind. You've heard this term before, blood is thicker than water. And I know that you hear that term and you think, well, that means my family bonds are bigger than my friendships. What if I told you that wasn't true? What if I told you that your understanding of that phrase is completely off and that it means maybe even the opposite? Oh, my Lord. Well, Gina's going to talk to us about that. She is so great. So we're going to talk about trauma. We're going to talk about those phrases. We're going to talk about how we have the tendency to gaslight ourselves when we've gone through something bad or deeply hurtful, and we try to convince ourselves that we didn't. And I did that as well. So I'm really excited for you to talk with Gina. Real quickly, if you haven't, I would be honored if you went and ordered Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic, pre-ordered it. You can go to christianalcoholic.com, christianalcoholic.com, and get it still for 40% off and free shipping from the publisher, or spend more money on Amazon. That's fine too. Okay. So without further ado, let's talk with Gina Birkemeier. Gina, thank you so much for joining the Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic podcast. This is such a treat for me because your book is one of those that I picked up. I'd kind of been, people had started, I'd seen it pop up and I picked it up, and it was just instantly, I was like, oh yes. Okay. Thank you, Lord. And so this is a real honor for me. Thank you for joining.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
And, it's always great when you're talking a little bit before recording, and you're just like, feel like old friends. And so I love that.
Yeah,
Thank
me
you.
too.
So before we get into some of the stuff I want to talk about, the epigenetics and the trauma, I think you have such a great story, and I continue to encourage people to pick up Generations Deep, because it's really your story is so front and center. But for people who haven't read the book yet, can you give us a background on your story when it comes to especially the idea of trauma and quote unquote generational curses, which we'll get into that verse in a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So my story that I tell in Generations Deep actually starts way before me. It starts with my great-grandparents coming over from Italy before they were even married, each one of them being here separately. And I tell the story of how from one generation to the next, there was this perpetrating of patterns, beliefs, behaviors that sort of formed and informed one generation to the next. But with that came a lot of harm. There is a lot of abandonment in my history. The whole family history. There is history of abandonment, fatherlessness. There is addiction. There is a lot of emotional immaturity, which can be so easily passed from one generation to the next. In my story, what I talk about is how when one generation doesn't heal, they pass on the things that can harm the next generation. And that becomes the new normal. And it's what we do from one generation to the next. And as that passed down, my mother was a single mom. I was born to her when she was 19 years old. She was not married. She was not with my father. My grandmother was 14, almost 15 when she had my mother. And then there was also some fatherlessness even before that from a broken marriage, and then a new marriage that was the result of an affair, and all of these patterns that just went from one generation to the next and the next until it came to me. And I found myself in a place where I was repeating a lot of those same patterns, where a lot of the ways that my ideas of coping with the world had been sort of skewed because of the traumas that I had endured as a child. I was given up for adoption twice. My biological mother gave me up, took me back, gave me up again. And there's something in my field that we talk about attachment, and we know those first 2 years are so important. And because there was so much chaos in those first years, that impacted the rest of the relationships that I had in my life for a very long time. And then I found myself as an early young adult, late teens and early 20s, I found that I was repeating a lot of those same patterns that had been perpetrated through my family, and realized that that was going to continue unless I did something about it.
Great introduction, and yet it's like, again, I can't impress you guys enough to go read the book, because there are so many details. I'm a big fan. I didn't do AA, but I read the AA big book, and I think one of the aspects that I found helpful was the stories in the back, right? Is that you're able to see yourself. And so I will say I saw myself and my family in Gina's story, but there wasn't necessarily mirroring aspects. There were some similar aspects, and yet I can read your story and say, oh my gosh, yes, abandonment, fatherlessness, the addiction aspects. And so I really encourage people to go read that. Okay, so what you talked about, the fact that that aspects of unhealth carry on through generations. Now, I think inherently we know that, right? We say, oh, alcoholism runs in the family, right?
Mhm.
So I don't think anyone would deny that, right? Like, oh, okay.
Right. Sure.
But you have a really fascinating, there's scientific proof of that, and it's through something called epigenetics. And I mentioned this in my book a little bit, but can you explain epigenetics and how, in a sense, those generational issues are literally passed down through DNA?
Mm-hmm. So, yes, I can. And I'd love to put it alongside scripture.
Amen.
Because where we see, so there's this verse, and I start the book really talking about this verse, that the sins of the father are passed on to this third and fourth generation. And hold that in your mind, that third and fourth generation piece, because that's going to be important. And so for a long time, I looked at that verse and I thought, wow, that doesn't feel like a loving God to me. This
Same.
was when I was in my dysfunction, right? When I had these ideas about who God was. I was sort of believing in the wrong Jesus there for a while, and thinking about God sort of cracking this whip that would reach out and leave a mark 3 to 4 generations after us. And I couldn't reconcile that with this idea of a loving God. I just didn't understand that. And it, quite frankly, made me a little angry. And so, and that was as I was beginning to learn about how the generations before had impacted me, and when I was coming to terms with some of those things. And part of that process is a grieving process. So bearing in mind that anger makes sense, as it is one of the stages of grief. So it does make sense that I would be angry with that and try to understand, how does it all fit? And then I started learning about epigenetics. And what I learned was, it isn't so much about the DNA, it's about the not the genetics, it's the epigenetics. So the epigenetics, so if we say epi, we're thinking like above or around, and epigenetics are really what influence the genetics. So we could look at the genetics as the script to the book, okay, or the script to the movie. And we can say that the epigenetics is the editor. The epigenetics is what comes in and says, nope, we're taking this part out. We're going to make this part bigger. We're going to enlarge this. This is going to be stronger. This is going to be weaker. It's kind of like the thing that will turn on or off certain behaviors, beliefs, genetic predispositions. And the epigenetic influencers is what is the most important thing to focus on. And those are the things that we consume. And when I say consume, I don't just mean food. I mean, what we consume in think holistically, like mind, body, spirit, right? What do we consume? What do our relationships look like? What has formed and informed our beliefs about ourselves, about other people, about the world around us, about God? What are all those influencers? And what's fascinating is there's some research out of Emory that showed with mice, that mice could be introduced to something as neutral as the smell of a cherry blossom. And if it was paired with a negative stimuli, like a small shock, they would learn when the shock was taken away that just the smell of the cherry blossom would trigger them. But the really fascinating part was that their pups would be born with the same response without having had that negative stimuli introduced to them. The part that I love the most, because we know that we are not wired for the trauma, we are wired for the healing.
Mm.
is that there is other research out of the University of Zurich in Switzerland with Dr. Isabel Mansway that shows when you take these pups and you put them in an enriched environment, and there's been other places that have done this research as well, that you can actually reverse what has happened, and that then the next generation can be born without that trigger response to those things.
Mm.
And what's interesting is if you don't provide an intervention like nurturing care, like a safe environment, if you don't put those things in and you just wait for it to naturally dissipate, it will take 3 to 4 generations. Yeah, right. I
Right?
know. I
That's
know.
crazy.
I know. I know. I'm like, to me, that's one of those places where it looks like scripture's trying to inform science.
Yeah.
And what I really love is, and this was my shift in perspective on that verse kind of started way before I knew what epigenetics were, but really what I've come to realize about that verse is it isn't this punitive God who's cracking the whip and saying, "Yep, what you do now, I'm going to make them pay for it." It's this loving God who is saying, "I'm trying to warn you here.
Yes.
Do something with what you have been handed, because it's not your fault what happened, but it's your responsibility what you do with it. And if you don't do something good with it, you're going to pass something different on to the next generation."
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's about, we break the cycle for ourselves first, and then we pass that on, because curses don't end, they're broken. We have to break them.
Mm.
And I think God draws us and invites us into doing that work.
I'm glad that verse is so important. I think what I'm hearing you say, and I want to drive this home, is that verse is a statement of fact. It is not a threat.
That's right.
And growing up, that verse was used as a threat to me. It was used as a way to say, you better not engage in X, Y, and Z, because you will bring this curse on your next generation. So
Yeah.
even, don't have sex before marriage, because you're inviting, here's what the Bible says,
Yep.
or, whatever it was. And so like you, I had grew up with that understanding. And yet, as I went through intensive therapy over the last year, realized I don't think that's what that verse. I don't think that's what that means. What you think it means, for
Right.
Princess Bride. It's like, my wife will be very happy that I worked in a Princess Bride reference.
Yeah, that was well done. Very well done. Yeah.
So let me ask you this. I want to go back to that epigenetics. So how, and some of these I'm going to ask like dumb questions, but my oldest brother my oldest brother is not an alcoholic, right? The epigenetics, the way that it worked the trauma, the whatever didn't turn him into an alcoholic, but I became an alcoholic. So how do you explain, or how does it work where maybe one sibling, takes a nosedive and the other one is like, but I'm fine. How do you resolve that, or how does epigenetics explain those differences?
Sure. So first I want to say that fine is a very relative term, and that there are some societal accepting behaviors that are actually addictive behaviors. Okay. So yes, it might, and part of this is about like how you're wired, who you are. We're all individual. That's what I love about the way God approaches, is there's no formula. I mean, he sees us as we're each individual, and this is true whether it's in the trauma or in the healing. And there's some like broad, 50,000 foot concepts that are true for everybody, but it's not, when you get down to the base level, there's some very specific things for each one of us. And so and I talk about this in the book, while it may manifest very overtly for some people in behaviors like drug addiction, or violent behaviors, or narcissistic personality disorder, or it could be very big and overt. It might be that you are a chronic people pleaser. You are a perfectionist to the point of paralysis and physical sickness. You are so concerned about your physical appearance because you believe that is going to put something out at the world. People will see a worth in you. So you become obsessed with working out. You become obsessed with every morsel that you put in your body. Maybe you become hyper spiritual and you bypass everything and you're just the quote unquote good Christian who is there every time the doors are open and sits in the parking lot when they're not and serves until your fingers are worked to the bone and you're weary because you're trying to work out those things that have happened to you rather than deal with them. So I would say that it's different for each of us, and numbing comes in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and maladaptive coping comes in all kinds of shapes and sizes.
Such a great point, right? I mean, I think we and I, especially as I play the comparison game, I think the comparison game is what is one of the biggest factors to my destructive path to drinking. Well, I'm not doing this, right? Or I don't look
Yeah.
like this. My drinking doesn't look like this, right? I think in the same way, people can say, "Well, I'm fine." You know, why are you struggling with that? Like, I'm fine. And meanwhile, their form of addiction is just culturally acceptable, right?
Yes,
And
that's right.
so I love that. Thank you for pointing that out. You talked about breaking the curse, breaking the pattern, if you will. If people, if even the curse language is still too strong for some people, how do you do that? What does that
Yeah.
look like?
Oh, that is the $50 million question, right? So I will say this, and I know that people are going to listen to this. I pray that people are going to listen to this who are all over the spectrum with their faith, and they're not really sure what they think, what they believe, and how deeply they want to get into any of that. And I will say that's okay. You don't have to believe it for it to be true. You don't have to dive in deeply to those aspects to understand that there is a design to your body, to your brain, to your nervous system, and we want to work with that, regardless of where you are on the faith scale. And hopefully that will eventually lead you to the loving God who designed you that way.
Amen.
But there are pieces of this that no matter where you are, you can take this in and use it in your life. So when we talk about breaking curses, and we tongue in cheek say, well, it starts with me. Well, what does that even mean? It means that we have to first get honest with ourselves. Sometimes that starts with permission. I run Generations Deep groups where people come together and we work through story together in a structured environment. And one of the things that we consistently see in our groups, whether it's me or one of my other facilitators, what we see in the groups is that people have a hard time giving themselves permission to say this happened. And it happened in this generation, it happened in that generation, it happened, and yes, it is a big deal. Because they somehow feel like they're betraying someone.
Yes.
Or they feel like once that cat is out of the bag, then people will see them differently. And so really it starts with us. It starts with us being able to say, I didn't get what I needed as a kid. And I recognize there are some things that are the result of that. And I don't know what all they are, but I just know that this is destructive. And then you get help, right? You sit with a therapist who can help you unpack those things, who can help you recognize and help you give yourself permission to say, yeah, that was a big deal and it did matter. In the book, we have something called the ETPQ, which is the Expanded Trauma Perspective Questionnaire. And the reason that we wrote that, it was myself and 60 other therapists who contributed to that. And the reason that we wrote it is because all of us in this line of work find that we sit with people who won't name the trauma because it's not one of those adverse childhood experiences traumas, like the big capital T trauma. And so immediately in their mind, they're comparing, oh, well, I don't get permission to say that because at least this didn't happen.
Right.
And most of those people were raised in an environment that taught them to negate their own feelings and their own needs. And so they're just affirming what they learned as a child. So really helping people to own the narrative, because you can't rewrite the narrative until you know what the original script is that you're working with. You have to admit to yourself what that is, admit to yourself the harm that's been done to you because of it, and then admitting to yourself the harm that maybe you've perpetrated as a result of that as well. Not for shame and condemnation, because those are never from God, but in a way that just says, I need to own this, I need to grieve it, and I need to figure out how to do better.
Glad you brought up ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and then the ETPQ, because while I do have one of those capital T traumas, even that. I mean, I remember there were some times over the last year with my therapist where she had to stop me and say, stop questioning yourself. Right.
Yes.
Like, and by the way, and maybe you can comment on this. I think there are some people, I did EMDR therapy. I know you talk about that in the book. And one of the charges that I've heard levied against it is like, there was the psychological movement of repressed memories, that was in the 80s and 90s, and people were all of a sudden remembering things that then found out, okay, they weren't true, they're making them up. And I've heard some people talk about that with EMDR therapy. Well, are you just making this up? Are you accessing these repressed memories and just making stuff up? Have you heard this? How do you respond to some of that?
So I will say this, the memory is kind of a tricky thing sometimes. And also, be very careful who's asking that question.
Mm-hmm.
But also those of us who have experienced trauma have a tendency to gaslight ourselves.
Yeah.
We have a tendency to say it wasn't that big of a deal, or that's not really how it happened, or whatever that might be. EMDR, the idea behind EMDR is to work with the memory that is there.
Uh-huh.
And we work with whatever that memory is. That's the memory that we work with. I would say that sometimes that whole idea of repressed memories and or is that really real, or did that really happen? I just work with what the client brings me.
Yeah.
And because the goal is, even if they can convince themselves or someone else can convince themselves that didn't really happen, their nervous system is not going to believe them. Their nervous system and the memory with the visceral memory is still going to say, yes, it did. Yes, it did. Yes, it did. And so that's why we work with what's brought to us. The same way that sometimes there isn't a memory, but the nervous system and the body is saying, yeah, there is. But the brain is saying, well, I can't find it. If it's there, I can't find it. Sometimes that is even the aftermath of generational trauma. You're carrying the burden. In IFS, they call it legacy burdens. You're carrying the burden, but you can't quite put your finger on what exactly it is, because it maybe didn't start with you. It started before you. And so then we work with the feeling in EMDR, and we start there, and then we look at where it might have tentacles out into other parts of your life. But the goal is not to rehearse those things. The goal is to process those things, to move through them, because we reinforce what we rehearse. So we don't want to stay stuck in that loop of telling the trauma over and over and over again. The idea, good EMDR helps us process through, not stay stuck in.
There's so many places that I could take that, but I'll say this is, yes, I think that is helpful. I mean, in my own trauma, it wasn't that I didn't know it was there. I was trying to minimize it. Right.
Sure.
And, wow, we were young, we were little. And I think my therapist finally said, okay, that can be true, but how are you feeling about it today?
Exactly.
Like, oh, well, I guess I'm struggling through it. Okay. So it was something, wasn't it?
Yes.
You know what I mean?
That's good.
It's
That's
like,
good. Yes.
What, and you talk about this in the book too. And, and I think over the last 18 months, this is what's been so helpful to me is, you can hold the competing ideas and they can both be true.
That's right.
You were young, mine involves my sister. Your sister was young, right? And yet what she did can be wrong or traumatic or made you feel awkward and weird, and you wanted people to stop it and you wanted help. And yet, yeah, maybe she was young and the culpability isn't there as if she was a 25-year-old or whatnot. Like, those two things can be true at the same time, and we don't like that. Like, we have a hard time with that, right?
Yeah, our brain really wants to put things in boxes and that binary, and I think the people around us encourage us to do that as well. Like to say, you can hold on to the good things or you can hold on to the bad things, you decide.
Yeah.
And I would say, rather than saying that, is you hold on to the good and the bad. The good is what helps fuel you to process through the bad. The good can give us fuel for that. But the other thing that it does is it gives us the ability to hold that intention, that good, and the two things that seem competing, hold those intention, not only for other people, but for ourselves. Because otherwise, then we ourselves are forced into the binary of, well, am I good or am I bad?
Yeah.
Did I do these horrible things and I'm a horrible person? Or is there good in me and I do good things? Which is it? Rather than saying it's dignity and depravity. It's those two that coexist within me. And what I feed gets stronger, right? But even being able to have grace for ourselves in the journey, we have to learn how to hold those things in tension in order to do that.
We'll be right back after this. So I'm trying to, we've talked a little bit about internal family systems therapy. You mentioned IFS with Dr. Allison Cook, but you brought something up in relation to it that I would love you to explain more, because I think it especially fits well with epigenetics, and that is legacy burdens.
Mm-hmm.
Explain legacy burdens, and especially how we can experience, in a sense, the pain and the trauma of something that was never done to us, but was done to our, for lack of a better term, ancestors, right? What are legacy burdens, and how does that work?
Yeah, so it's basically what we've talked about. The legacy burden is the thing that is carried from one generation to the next. We don't necessarily have in real time, we can say, oh, well, this event happened, and so it's connected to this feeling, right? It's that burden of, so for a great example from my book is shame.
Yes.
I say that in my family, shame was a legacy. Shame would be a legacy burden, where there's this idea of self that has been marred and wounded. And then your sense of self that has been marred and wounded passes on to the next generation in how you form and inform them. And then their sense of self is marred and wounded. And that becomes something that just gets carried down the line without anyone being able to say, oh, look, that's where it happened. This is the pinpoint of it happening in my life.
Right. Okay, so let me just kind of switch gears a little bit here and say, you talk about, especially when it comes to interrupting patterns and generational trauma and curses, you talk about these things called ECEs, emotionally corrective experiences. Explain emotionally corrective experiences, why they're so important.
Yes, it's actually one of my favorite things to talk about.
Woo! So, I win. I passed the quiz.
It's so good, because it is that whole thing that reminds us that we're not wired for the trauma, we're wired for the healing. And so an emotionally corrective experience is when we've had some sort of wounding, and typically it's about a core wound. It's something that hit the identity, the center of who we are, right? It informed a negative belief about ourselves, about who we are, about our value, about our worth. And then later in life, and it can be any time later in life, we have this experience with someone that we can't explain how or why in the moment, but it just catapults us back into that wound and heals it. And it's like it corrects that. So one of the stories that I tell in the book is related to one of my professors. And we are in our cohort and we're processing some things that happened with clients. And I had a really unfortunate situation in my first internship site. And I was talking about that and about how excited I was about this work that I had done with my client, and how my supervisor had kind of shut it down because she was sort of spiritually bypassing some things, and just my frustration with that. But what it did is it kind of hit at that place of I wasn't enough, right? Like, you did it wrong. You're not enough. And I could feel my face getting hot as I was talking about it in the room, And my professor said, he was kind of frustrated, and he was like, okay, well, we'll talk about that more. And then just went on. And then the catalyst for that for that ECE was a cohort member friend of mine who said, hold on a second. And he looks at me and says, did you just get what you needed in that moment? And then my face really did get hot. And I remember literally I got this pinpoint tunnel vision going. And it was I knew it was a pivotal moment. I could either say the truth or I could do what I always did, which was tough, my tough girl. I was the
Mm-hmm.
tough girl. You can't get in because it's all steel coated with
Yeah.
Teflon, right? Can't get in here. And so in that moment, I took the chance and said, actually, no, I didn't.
Uh,
And immediately the switch went on for my professor. And he leaned in, and Simon leaned in, and the rest of the cohort leaned in. And to the point where I finally had to say, okay, I'm good.
yeah.
I'm good. Too much,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I get in the car and I'm driving home, and I still get a little emotional about this one.
Mm,
I get in the car and I'm driving home, and the tears just start coming to the point where I have to pull my car over.
wow.
And in the moment I realized what was going on, that was the first time in my life when not only did one man interject for me with no ulterior agenda, but another man in authority, father figure type man stood up for me and said, it's not okay, and I'm going to do something about it.
Wow.
And it's like it healed all these little girl pieces of me in that moment that had experienced the opposite growing up. And it was
Mm,
just really this beautiful opportunity for me to see myself differently because of how I was treated in that moment. And it really healed some emotions for me. It corrected some ideas I had about myself in that moment.
how do we recognize those ECEs? I mean, is it just kind of your body? You'll know, or
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I think we all have experiences of those, but we didn't know what to call them. I
Mm,
think your body knows. I believe we have this in group all the time. We talk about ECEs and we really break them down and do a pretty deep dive into what they are and why we care and how do we even give ourselves opportunities for those things, right? Like
yeah.
they're typically organic, but sometimes we can help them along. And so it's interesting. One of the homework assignments that I give is I want you to think about, now that you know all this about ECEs and you've read this part of the book, I want you to go home and think about some things that might you look back and you're like, oh, you know what? I think that might have been an ECE.
Right.
And then they will come and say, I think across the board, like we've had about over 200 women come through groups. And I can say up to this point, I've not had one not come up with an ECE. But what's also been beautiful is a lot of times their ECE is something that happened in the group, which
Mm,
is really, really beautiful. Um, yeah, so yes, to answer your question, I do. I think it's something that we feel it. Our nervous system says something is healing in this
yeah.
moment. Yeah.
So you said something there that kind of triggered a question, and it's a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I'm going to chase it.
Okay.
Is you talked about the women in your group. I think one of the pieces of feedback that I've gotten a lot as I've been talking about my own, whether it's ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, big T trauma, little T trauma, alcoholism, which some people don't like that term. We have a whole episode on that. Is there's a lot of resources, and it seems like for women, and women are at least a little bit more apt to go through
Hmm.
an EMDR counseling, an IFS, sit with
Yeah.
a counselor. And so some people have said this, and I don't say this in a prideful way. They look at me like I have three heads. They're like, you're a man, you went through this and you're talking about this. And I'm like, I don't know. I guess I've always connected with women,
Yeah.
and so maybe I'm a little bit more of a softie. But how do we get men talking about this more and doing, we like to say in the business, doing the work?
Doing the work, doing the work. I love that. So let me just say this. I am praying for the day when I have a male counterpart that comes to me and says, I want to do men's groups for Generations Deep. Will you train me? I haven't had one yet. The day one
Well,
shows
you
up.
might be looking at him, Gina.
Okay. That's another conversation we
Yeah.
should definitely have.
Yeah, right.
I would be all over that. So it's that, right? I think that unfortunately, this is another thing where society has not done us any favors.
Mm-hmm.
I think men are, and it's changing. The ship is turning. But I think traditionally and historically, men have not, that's not been permissible.
Yeah.
You don't get to say that this wounded me. You don't get to say this marred my identity or this hurt me, right? That's not something that men have been okay with saying because it wouldn't be accepted.
Yeah.
right? You're just supposed to, and it's a shame. It's horrible that's kind of been the trajectory. But I think that sometimes doing the work for men, it gets harder because also men will just try to outperform the trauma. You
Mm.
know, like if I have big enough muscles and a big enough bank account and a big enough car and a big enough house and a pretty enough wife and good enough kids, and right, like they just try to outperform the trauma, almost like trying to prove to themselves that it's not going to have weight in their life and that they are worth something. And
Yeah.
here's all the markers that prove that they are worth something.
Yeah.
And and really we see that, I want to be careful. This isn't an always statement. It's an often statement. The typical thing we see with trauma is that women will turn it inward and it will harm them, and then they kind of out of their wounding may harm others. But often men will turn it outward,
Mm-hmm.
and it gets kind of pushed out into the world, whether it's with anger,
Mm-hmm.
or using, or whatever it might be, or a trail of broken relationships where they're just, chronically dating and breaking hearts, and
Yeah.
or maybe they have several children by different women that are all out there in the world, and they're not involved in any of those kids' lives. And it's kind of that out external aftermath, if you will, where women often carry around the internal aftermath.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that it becomes more acceptable for women to then do something with it,
Yeah.
because people are like, oh, I hope she gets some help. Right. Right.
Right.
And then we're looking at the guys and we're like, wow, look how hard he's working.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ah, that's a good point. I want to go back to something you said because I forgot to ask you, and then I remembered. Is when you talked about recognizing some of those family patterns, um, how do you begin to call those things out,
Mm.
and knowing that calling those things out, especially in a familial environment, in a family system, that people may not want you to recognize those, right? If you're starting to call out generational trauma and curses and issues, whatever you want to call it, I mean, there's some people who have a vested interest in you saying no, 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 right? So how do you do that in a way that is, I guess, honoring?
Hmm.
How do you do that in a way where they and maybe they won't necessarily accept it, but what's the best way to do that in your family?
Yeah. It's a great question. And two things I want to say to start us off. One is, don't look through the lens of how can I make this acceptable to others.
Mm,
That cannot be the lens. That will paralyze you if that's the lens that you look through. And the other is just to share my own story. I can tell you that there are people in my family who have not been happy about this book. They have not been happy about the work that I'm doing. Yeah, it's been very strained at best and disconnected in some of the harder places, which is okay. I'm okay with that. And 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 then the other thing is, in the book, there's a section where I ask people to ask themselves, why am I doing this work?
mm,
And so you really do want to check your motives, because you want to make sure that none of your motives are about hurting anyone else. You
yeah.
want to make sure that this is really coming from a place of, no, I genuinely want to stop this cycle. The stopping starts with me, and then I pass that new thing on, right? So as you call these out, I think the most effective place to start is boundaries. If there
Mm,
are people that are safe to have conversations with, where you can say, here is what I'm learning. Here is how I know it has impacted me, and I'd like to talk to you about that. And here's what won't be happening with my kids, or here's what won't be happening with me from here on.
mm-hmm.
And those boundaries are really, really important, especially as you keep trying to do this work. And because you have sort of known one way of doing things, the other thing is you have to surround yourself with resources that help you learn a new way.
Mm-hmm.
It's not fair to yourself to say, well, I know this is wrong now, so I should just automatically know what's right. That's not going to work either.
Right.
You're still going to get triggered. You're still going to have some of those automatic responses that are born out of trauma. But we go for resources then, right? We change the people that are around us. We get a good support system if we don't already have one. We learn what safe people are and how to choose them in our lives. And I think the boundary piece is really, I'll go back to that one more time. It is really important. And some of it is that you've decided that you're not going to be talked to a certain way anymore,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or that you're no longer going to hold a secret that you've been asked to hold.
Mm.
That you're going to tell the truth about what happened. And you tell people that that's what's coming. You warn them insofar as it's safe to warn them. And sometimes it's not a decision to be made lightly, but sometimes there is need for no contact,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because you do have to decide, I can be in relationship with this person and deny my own healing, or I can not be in relationship with that person and pursue my own healing, which,
Mm-hmm.
as you know, is never really just about us. It's always about others as well, right?
Yeah. And I would say too, I think just for people listening is some, and then there's times there's people that you think will be very accepting and ready to hear it, and then you tell them and they are not ready.
Yeah.
And I've experienced that, right? And so I think what you said is, I think where I've landed, especially on some of those conversations, is this is for my healing, and it's actually for their healing as well.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
You said honor earlier.
mm,
And, we talk about this a lot. We have this skewed idea of honor. Silence isn't honor. Silence is not honor.
mhm,
Keeping silent is not honor. The best way to really honor those who've gone before you is to heal and not pass it on. That
yeah,
really is the best way to honor them. And I will say, on the flip side of what you just mentioned about sometimes you think, okay, I can talk to this person, it's going to be okay. And then it's like a train wreck. Sometimes you think you cannot talk to
yeah,
somebody and then you do talk to them and you're shocked at how well it goes.
right,
Yeah.
right. Um, by the way, I forgot to ask you before we started if you have a hard stop at the top of the hour, or if I can ask some more
Actually, my
questions.
hard stop is 11:30, so I'm
Okay,
okay.
perfect.
Mhm.
So all of this brings me this little conversation we've been having brings me to something fascinating that I heard you say in another podcast, and I think it maybe you listener are going to talk to family and you're like, okay, it's time we kind of stop sweeping this on the rug, and they say this phrase, well, blood is thicker than water, and you blew my mind with this little takedown of blood is thicker than water.
Yeah.
Explain to everyone what that actually means.
I've never heard of it as a takedown, but I like that, John. I think I'm going to use that in the future. Okay, so we've all heard blood is thicker than water. I think we've all been told it. It's been used as a tool to silence us,
Yep.
to line us back up with the status quo of the family. But what we aren't told is the whole saying. And the whole saying is that the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. And what that means is that when you enter into covenant with someone, whether it is, it's your comrades in battle, right? Maybe it's your therapist, it's your relationship with God. If you're in a covenantal marriage, it's your spouse. It's not the family you were born into by blood and womb. That's not what that saying is about.
Mm-hmm.
So it's who is in it with you in the battle.
So it
That is
really
your
means,
blood of covenant.
and it really means the opposite.
The opposite. It really means the opposite.
It's the opposite. The blood of the covenant is thicker than
Thicker
the
than the
water
water.
of the womb. Not the blood of your family is, that just, I think my wife and I were driving at the time and I like stopped it and I like rewound it and I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to hear that again. Because I think you're right. It is used as such a tool. It is used as a way
weapon.
to silence people. Blood is thicker than water. Blood is thicker than water. Yep, it is, and actually in the complete opposite way. We'll be right back after this. This leads to this question, which is, I think, while I've gone through a lot of counseling and a lot over the last, when we're recording this, 18 months, there are some people that I look at in my family that I'm like, you've experienced trauma, but you are not dealing with it. And at times, then them refusing to deal with it means that they're bleeding all over everyone else, right?
Yep.
And so I oscillate at times between being frustrated with them and then having compassion. And sometimes it's in the same conversation, because I'm like, come on, like deal with this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I think you do so well in the book is you have compassion for your family. You have compassion for people. Your book is not a I'm going to trash everyone in my life that's ever hurt me. There is a lot of compassion, even more so than I think, probably I would have, right? Towards the people who have hurt you and done things to you. How do we have that compassion for people, especially when it seems so obvious to us that they need to get help?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, thank you. I will say that in some places, I think the grace and the compassion that I show is a little bit selfish, because it was for my healing to afford them grace and compassion. Holding on, just even the idea of holding on to unforgiveness, right? Like we use that terminology. When you're holding on to something, you have no open hand to grab your future, your healing, any of those things. So really, and true forgiveness does require some compassion and some grace and mercy. But thank you for saying that. I think when we're talking about these relatives who are still dealing with it and maybe even bleeding on to other people, again, I go back to the idea of boundaries. What are our boundaries going to be? Sometimes we have to shift our boundaries with those people and to be very clear with them on why we're shifting our boundaries with them. Whether they choose to accept that or not is not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to say it in a way that is as honoring and kind as we can be with the truth that needs to be told. Scripture says that he came in grace and truth, and I think that there is intentionality in that order. I think without grace, we can't receive real truth. And so to be able to do that is important. I think the other thing we have to look at is our own position when we are angry. Sometimes we feel like, well, we have to hold on to the anger because that's what keeps our guard up and it doesn't allow them to come back in and hurt us again. Rather than saying, actually, I don't have to be angry. I just need boundaries. I just need to have good boundaries. And if you think you have the kind of relationship with that person where you can say, here's what I see, and here's what I hope you will do someday. And if you ever choose to, let me know, and I will walk alongside you in that journey if you can do that in a way that doesn't harm you, depending on what the relationship has been. I think that's a possibility as well. But we're all going to have those sandpaper people in our lives. No matter how close they are, it's up to us how much access we allow them to have. And boundaries really are about us and about the access that we allow people to have. We don't set our boundaries for other people. We set them for ourselves, and we don't make them in anger. Because if you make your boundary in anger when you're not angry anymore, you won't hold that boundary. And then what you've done is taught people that they can just do whatever they want as long as you're not mad.
Can you unpack that a little? I highlighted that. You say that in your book, and I highlighted it, but I had to go back and read it. So unpack that a little bit more. If we make our boundaries in anger, you're saying that just maybe unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, maybe an example might help.
Yes.
So say that I'm restructuring my boundaries with my mother, who doesn't want to hear how she impacted me, what she did hurt me. Okay. And I try once again to tell her how it impacted me, and it turns into a fight. And now I'm angry. And now I'm like, you know what? That's it. I'm done. I'm not talking to her anymore. I'm not emailing her. I'm blocking her from my phone. She's not going to see the kids anymore. And I just start blah, 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 right? Like I've got this whole laundry list of boundaries made in anger. Okay. Rather than, okay, that conversation didn't go well, so I'm going to pull back access. I'm going to let mom know, listen, this is a conversation that I have to have with you. And so we can still see each other at family functions and do those kinds of things, but our access to one another is going to be limited until we can have this conversation. And then when she gets angry, I can hold on to that rather than the other way where maybe she's angry and I'm angry and I make all these boundaries in anger. And then she calls and says, all right, I'm sorry. And I'm like, okay, fine. And then, and then all the boundaries fall to the floor.
Or even points out you did that, you were brash about that, and you're like, well, I guess I kind of was brash about that. Yeah, because you were, right? Because you weren't reasoned and logical and calm about it.
Right.
So helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Final question. I think if there's people who are listening to this and they say, well, John, well, Gina, I'm sitting here, I'm listening to this, maybe this was the final straw or whatever. And I'm realizing that there are these generational patterns in my life, but I've already had kids. Maybe they're teenagers, maybe they're younger, maybe they're grown. And I didn't step in and stop this. So is it too late? Are my kids going to carry that on now? And even if I make a decision now and call it out, what do you say to that person who hears this, believes it's true, but says, I think it's too late?
Well, I will say that I was that person because I had already had kids when I started getting into the deeper work.
Yeah.
And so I am a firm believer that it is not too late, but there are things that we will have to do differently. First of all, once again, I want to go back to breaking generational patterns is about us first. It's about doing something different in our own life so that we are different, not just in our family, but literally in every other relationship that we are in. We impact the world differently when we break those cycles for ourselves, when we no longer act and react out of those places that were wounded, out of those behaviors that were adapted or adopted because of our experiences. We just become a different person. And the other piece of that, I think, is that we have to own it. So if we recognize that we've perpetrated some of those things towards our children, then we have to sit down with our children and say, here is what I've learned. Here's what I'm learning. Here is what I'm trying to heal from. I can imagine how that hurt you. And I'm sorry. And I'm here to listen to how that harmed you. I want to bring good things into your life. You invite them into the counseling process with you, invite them to tell you what the impact has been on their life. I think whatever that needs to look like for you and your kiddos, that you can have those conversations and then continue to heal. And we don't, not to the point where no one should be weaponizing their wounds, right? Like we're not opening ourselves up like for target practice, where we say, hey, let me have it. Let me have it. That's not the idea. The idea is respectfully to sit down and say, here's what I'm learning and here's how I imagine that it impacted you. But I don't get to tell you how it impacted you. You get to tell me how it impacted you. And I want to hear that. But I want us to have a conversation about it because I want to move towards something healthier in our relationship with one another.
Yeah. Oh, so good. Obviously, if people want to pick up the book Generations Deep, it's on Amazon and whatnot. But if they want to hear and learn more about the work that you're doing, these groups as well that you've started, where can they go to find out more about what you're doing?
Yeah, they can find me at GinaBirkemeier.com, and they can also find me on the socials at My Out Loud Voice.
Awesome. Gina, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. It has been, I continue to be introduced and find people that are just life-changing. And I think you're doing life-changing work. And so I'm so excited for people to hear this, to be introduced to you, to read Generations Deep and the other work that you're going to continue to put out for years to come. So Gina, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, John.
Silence isn't honor. Oh, when Gina said that, I was like, yes. And I think it works so well with what she said about men as well. If you're a man listening to this, that we will just try to outperform the trauma in our lives. And I think there's a lot of men out there who would rather sit in silence because they think silence is honor, and they would rather just outperform it. And listen, that's not just a male thing. And yet I think that it tends to dominate in male culture as well. But there are so many good things in that interview. I'm so thankful for Gina. She has, again, been so supportive of the book coming out. She's been so supportive of me personally. We are in a group together where we get to talk about these things, and I've just come to really enjoy her and the work that she is doing. If you appreciate this conversation, if you appreciate all of our conversations, if you want to go back and listen to more, by the way, you can. But please consider liking, subscribing, and especially rating. If you're listening to this on Apple, please just hit the stars. Spotify, same thing. It really goes a long way. We are getting closer and closer to book launch, and I want to get this message out to the most amount of people. Finally, if you go to christianalcoholic.com, I just did something this week where you can be part of the launch team for this book, and it's via text message. I'm so tired of algorithms these days. I've given up on the Facebook group because it's not because of you guys. It's just because Facebook, I put something in that Facebook group to launch the book and no one sees it. Literally, I mean, it shows me how many people see it, and it's because they're not sending it out. And so if you want to help launch this book, and I'm going to be doing something on my social media later this week to show you exactly the kind of messages that are being sent to people, the messages that are being, sent to people via even Christian circles about recovery. So I'm going to read an excerpt, I believe, from a book, a Christian book, or I should say a book from a Christian author that came out on recovery that just baffled me. And these are the kind of things that are being said to people that I think is just counter to the gospel. And so that's why I need your help to get the message of Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic, the book, out there. So please go to christianalcoholic.com. As always, visit lifeaudio.com to listen to more great podcasts. So thankful and grateful to them for their partnership. Love you all, and we will see you next week.